The biting wind howled through the canyon, carrying with it the icy sting of a full-blown blizzard. I hunched deeper into my saddle, pulling my worn coat tighter. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to keep moving, to find shelter, to escape this unforgiving landscape. But then I saw her. A huddled form barely visible through the swirling snow, slumped against a rock face. An Apache woman. My mind immediately flashed back to the warnings I'd heard in every dusty saloon, and around every flickering campfire. Tales of Apache raiders of brutal violence that followed wherever their paths crossed with settlers. The unspoken rules of the frontier etched into every man's soul, helping the wrong person could get you killed. But looking down at her, seeing her shivering, vulnerable form, all those warnings felt distant, meaningless. My gut twisted. I couldn't just leave her to freeze. With a sigh that turned to vapor in the frigid air, I dismounted. The snow was already knee-deep, making every step a struggle. I unwrapped the thick wool blanket from my bedroll. It was my best possession, the only thing truly keeping me warm during these brutal nights on the trail. My grandmother, bless her soul, had made it years ago before the fever took her. The blue and gray pattern was faded now, but it still held heat like nothing else I owned. It was more than just wool. It was a piece of home, a tangible link to a softer past. Without a word, I knelt beside her and gently wrapped the blanket around her trembling shoulders. She looked up at me, her dark eyes wide with surprise, as if kindness from a white man was the absolute last thing she expected. Her fingers, stiff and numb with cold, gripped the edges of the blanket, gratefully clutching it like a lifeline. "You'll be all right," I murmured softly, my voice rough with concern, though I wasn't sure she understood a single word of English. Her breathing, ragged moments before, began to steady as the warmth seeped into her body. Color slowly, miraculously returned to her pale cheeks. She studied my face with those penetrating dark eyes, and for a moment, something profound passed between us that neither of us fully understood. A silent acknowledgement, a shared moment of humanity against the indifferent fury of the storm. I helped her to her feet, her movement still a little clumsy, and guided her to a more sheltered spot behind a cluster of large rocks. The wind was less fierce there, and the snow didn't whip quite so violently. I quickly gathered what little dry kindling I could find, and built a small fire, the flames eagerly licking at the wood, casting dancing shadows on the canyon walls. I shared what little food I had, some dried jerky and a few hard biscuits. The woman who pointed to herself and said Talon ate slowly, deliberately, never taking her eyes off me. She seemed to be memorizing every detail of my face, every line, every shadow. It was an unnerving yet oddly captivating gaze. As the blizzard raged around us, we sat in comfortable, almost companionable silence. The fire crackled, a tiny beacon of defiance against the vast, cold wilderness. I found myself stealing glances at her, my mind buzzing with questions. Who was she? How had she ended up alone in such a deadly storm? Where was her family? But those questions would have to wait. Survival came first. When dawn finally broke, painting the sky in hues of bruised purple and pale orange, Talon stood. Her movements were fluid now, her strength returned. She carefully folded the blanket, smoothing out the wrinkles, and held it out to me. I shook my head. The biting cold had passed, and I had my thick canvas coat. She needed it more than I did, especially if she was still out here alone. Her eyes widened at my refusal to take it back. She spoke rapidly in Apache, her voice urgent, almost worried, gesturing between the blanket and herself, then pointing at me. I couldn't understand a single word, but her tone conveyed a sense of deep concern, even alarm. I just smiled a reassuring, if clueless, grin and mounted my horse. "Keep warm," I called back as I rode away, the words feeling utterly inadequate. I genuinely thought I'd done a good deed, a simple act of charity, and would never see her again. But as Talon watched me disappear into the morning mist, she clutched the blanket tighter. In her culture, what had just happened meant something very different than what the kind cowboy believed. And by sunset, her people would come looking for answers that would change both our lives forever. I reached the trading post by mid-afternoon, the chill of the morning still clinging to my bones, but my mind was already replaying the encounter with the Apache woman. Something about those eyes haunted me. The way she'd looked at me when I refused to take the blanket back, almost like she was trying to warn me about something. A shiver unrelated to the cold ran down my spine. The trading post, a sturdy log and stone structure, sat nestled in a small valley surrounded by towering pine trees. A thin wisp of smoke curled lazily from its stone chimney, promising warmth. Inside, the heat hit me like a physical wall, chasing away the last remnants of the blizzard's bite. 3 other men huddled around a rough-hewn table, playing cards, the air thick with the smell of stale tobacco and cheap whiskey. Murphy, the grizzled old trader, looked up from cleaning his rifle, his eyes narrowed in surprise. Jedediah Stone Murphy drawled, setting down his weapon with a clatter. "Didn't expect to see you until spring. That storm nearly killed my horses." Had to push through, I replied, unbuttoning my coat, the words feeling heavy on my tongue. Got business in Santa Fe that won't wait. Murphy poured me a cup of coffee. The liquid was steaming black and bitter, but I wrapped my cold hands around the tin cup, finally feeling human again. The warmth made me think of Kaylin, wondering if she'd made it to safety if she was warm. See any trouble on the trail? One of the card players asked. He was a thin man with nervous eyes and a nasty scar that bisected his jaw. Apache have been moving through these parts. Folks are getting spooked. I hesitated, the coffee suddenly tasting sour in my mouth. My first instinct was to mention Kaylin, to describe the desperate situation I'd found her in. But something held me back. These men wouldn't understand. They'd see only the danger, the perceived threat, not the frightened young woman who'd nearly frozen to death. They'd see a savage, not a human being. Nothing I couldn't handle, I said. Finally, my voice flat, betraying none of the turmoil churning inside me. The scarred man leaned back in his chair, a cynical smirk twisting his lips. Smart to keep moving. Last week they hit a wagon train 20 miles south, took everything, left the bodies for the buzzards. He spat a stream of tobacco juice into a brass spittoon. Animals, the lot of them. My jaw tightened. The word animals echoed in my head, a harsh counterpoint to the memory of Kaylin's grateful, vulnerable smile. Whatever those raiders had done, she wasn't part of it. She was just a woman who'd needed help. A woman I'd help. Murphy refilled my cup, his gaze assessing. You can bunk here tonight. Got a room in the back, but I'd move on at first light if I were you. Been hearing drums in the hills. When they start drumming, trouble follows. As if summoned by his words, a rhythmic beating drifted through the valley, low and steady, like a giant ancient heartbeat. Thump, thump. Thump, thump. The card game stopped abruptly. All eyes turned toward the windows, though there was nothing to see but the rapidly darkening sky. There it is again, the scarred man whispered, his nervous eyes darting around the room. Been going on for hours. I set down my cup, a cold knot forming in my stomach. The drumming seemed to be coming from multiple directions surrounding the valley. It wasn't random. There was a pattern to it. A complex rhythm, like a conversation being held in a language I couldn't understand. A language of warning, perhaps, or of gathering. Maybe they're just passing through, Murphy said, but his hand moved instinctively to his rifle resting on the counter beside him. His eyes, usually so shrewd, held a flicker of genuine fear. The drumming stopped abruptly. The silence that followed felt heavier, more ominous than the sound itself. It pressed in on us, a suffocating blanket of unspoken dread. I found myself thinking about the blanket again, the one I'd given to Kaylin, and the urgent way she'd spoken to me when I refused to take it back. Had she been trying to tell me something important? A warning. I'll take that room, I said, finishing my coffee in one gulp. My voice sounded calmer than I felt, but as I settled into the narrow bunk that night, sleep wouldn't come. The drums had started again, closer this time. The rhythmic thrum vibrated through the very ground beneath me, through the rough wooden walls of the trading post. And somewhere in that ancient rhythm I could swear I heard my name being called, a ghostly echo in the night. Jedediah. Jedediah. Outside, my window shadows moved between the trees. Not the random, aimless movement of animals, but the purposeful advance of people who knew exactly where they were going. People who were looking for someone, and in my gut a cold, hard certainty settled they were looking for me. Dawn came too early and too quiet. The drumming had stopped sometime before sunrise, leaving behind an unnatural silence that made my skin crawl. Even the birds seemed afraid to sing. I dressed quickly, my movements precise, my heart thudding a steady, anxious rhythm against my ribs. I stepped outside to check on my horse, Old Thunder. The animal was restless, ears twitching at sounds only it could hear, its nostrils flared, sensing the unseen presence. Murphy emerged from the main building, rifle in hand, worry etched deep in his weathered face. They're out there, Murphy said quietly, his voice barely a whisper. Been watching us all night. Haven't seen them, but I can feel eyes on me. Like 1,000 needles pricking my skin. I scanned the tree line. Nothing moved, not a leaf, not a shadow. But the feeling of being observed was unmistakable, palpable, like standing in front of a loaded gun knowing it was aimed directly at my chest. I saddled Thunder, every movement deliberate and calm. Panic would only make things worse. I had to think to act, not just react. I'm riding out, I announced, my voice firm despite the tremor in my hands. No point staying here if they want something. Better to face it head on. You're crazy. The scarred man hissed from the doorway, his face pale with fear. They'll pick you off before you reach the ridge. You'll be buzzard bait by noon, but I was already mounting up. Whatever was happening, whatever these Apache wanted hiding, wouldn't solve it. I'd rather face it in the open on my own terms than wait to be cornered like a rat in a trap. I rode slowly up the main trail, my hands visible, resting on the saddle horn, well away from my holstered pistol. The morning mist clung to the valley floor, making everything look ghostly and uncertain, blurring the edges of the familiar world. Thunder's hooves echoed off the canyon walls, the only sound in the oppressive quiet. The air was thick with anticipation, heavy with unspoken threats. Then they appeared. 7 Apache warriors materialized from the trees like shadows given form, silent and swift. They didn't rush forward or raise weapons. They simply stepped into view and waited, blocking the trail ahead. Their horses were painted for war-stark symbols against the pale morning, but the men themselves seemed calm, almost ceremonial. Their faces were stoic, their eyes unreadable. My hand instinctively moved toward my gun, a desperate, futile gesture, then stopped. These weren't raiders. Their posture was formal, almost dignified, not overtly threatening. One of them, an older man with intricate beadwork on his buckskin shirt, raised his hand in a gesture that clearly meant, "Stop." I reined in thunder, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. The older Apache spoke in his native tongue, his voice deep and resonant, carrying the weight of authority of generations of tradition. Behind him, the other warriors remained motionless, their dark eyes studying me with an intensity that made me feel like a specimen under glass, every flaw, every weakness exposed. Then from behind the group, another figure emerged. Talon. She wore the same deer-hide dress I'd seen her in yesterday. But now my blue and gray blanket, my grandmother's blanket, was draped over her shoulders like a ceremonial cloak, a symbol of something I didn't yet understand. Her eyes met mine, and I saw something there that made my blood run cold. Not fear, not gratitude, but responsibility. Heavy, unavoidable responsibility. A burden I hadn't asked for but seemed to have inherited. The older Apache spoke again, his voice firm, unwavering. This time Talon translated her English, carefully pronounced each word, tinged with an accent that made it sound almost musical yet chillingly clear. "My grandfather says you have claimed me as your wife," she said, simply, her gaze unwavering, her expression unreadable. Thunder shifted beneath me as if responding to my shock, my utter disbelief. "What I never—" "The blanket," I stammered, my voice cracking. Talon continued, her voice growing stronger, more resolute, as if reciting an ancient law. "In our ways, when a man gives his blanket to protect a woman, he declares his intention to provide for her, always to be her husband. It is a sacred vow." The words hit me like a physical blow, a punch to the gut. I stared at the blanket, my grandmother's blanket, now transformed into something I'd never intended it to be. A marriage contract, written in wool and good intentions. A binding agreement I'd unwittingly entered into. "That's not what I meant," I said, desperately, my voice rising. "I was just trying to help." She was freezing. Talon's grandfather, Chief Gray Eagle, spoke again, his tone brooking no argument, his gaze piercing. Talon translated, though. Her voice had become smaller, more vulnerable, as if the weight of his words pressed down on her too. He says, "Intentions matter less than actions. You saved my life and claimed me as yours. Now you must honor that choice." The canyon walls seemed to close in around me as the full crushing weight of my situation became clear. A simple act of kindness, a moment of human decency, had bound me to a woman I barely knew in a culture I didn't understand, with consequences I couldn't even begin to imagine. My mouth went dry as dust. 7 pairs of dark, unblinking eyes watched me, waiting for an answer that could determine whether I lived to see another sunset. The morning air suddenly felt thin, making each breath a conscious, painful effort. "I don't understand your ways," I said carefully, my voice echoing off the canyon walls, sounding foreign even to my own ears. "Where I come from, giving someone a blanket just means you don't want them to freeze to death. It's an act of compassion, not a proposal." Chief Gray Eagle, who Talon called Nish, listened to the translation and responded with what sounded like a question, his weathered face remaining impassive, but his eyes held the sharpness of a man who'd survived by reading people's hearts, by seeing beyond words to the truth. "He asks if you would have given the blanket to an Apache man," Talon translated, her voice barely above a whisper, her eyes searching mine. The question cut straight to the truth, a brutal, undeniable blade. I thought about it honestly, brutally. Would I have stopped for an Apache warrior? Even one freezing to death? Would I have risked my own warmth, my own safety for someone who might have been my enemy? Someone I'd been warned against my entire life? The answer sat heavy in my chest, a bitter taste in my mouth. "Probably not," I admitted, the words barely audible. The shame burned, but the honesty was necessary. Chief Gray Eagle nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something he already knew, something he'd expected. He spoke again, his words flowing like water over stones, ancient and certain, carrying the weight of generations. He says, "You chose to see me as a woman first, Apache second. This shows honor, but honor carries responsibility. Great responsibility." One of the younger warriors, a fierce-looking man with a braided queue and a hawk feather in his hair, shifted restlessly on his horse, his hand moving to rest on the hilt of his weapon, a glimmer of impatience in his eyes. I caught the movement and felt a cold trickle of sweat snake down my spine despite the morning chill. These men weren't just here to talk. They were here to enforce their customs whatever the cost. My life, perhaps. What happens if I refuse, I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. My voice was tight-strained. Kaylin hesitated, her gaze dropping for a moment before she began to translate. The conversation that followed was rapid and intense. A flurry of guttural Apache words with several warriors joining in, their voices rising in what sounded like angry debate. I watched their faces, trying desperately to read the emotions behind words I couldn't understand. Anger, defiance, a grim determination. When they finished, Kaylin's face had gone pale, her lips trembling slightly. "If you refuse," she whispered, her voice barely a thread, "you dishonor not just me but my family. My grandfather would be obligated to—" She paused, searching for the right words in English, her eyes pleading with me to understand the gravity of her next statement. "To restore our honor through blood. Your blood." The threat hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre, thick and suffocating. I looked at each warrior in turn, seeing the grim resolution in their faces, the unyielding adherence to their code. They weren't bluffing. In their world, this wasn't negotiable. It was a matter of honor, of survival, of the very fabric of their society. But then I looked at Kaylin, really looked at her. She stood straight and proud, a warrior's daughter. But beneath that brave facade, I could see the fear she was trying desperately to hide. Fear of what would happen to me. Fear of what would happen to her family if violence erupted, if I chose to fight. Fear of being caught between two worlds that didn't understand each other, that seemed destined to clash. A choice. Accept a marriage to save my life, but trap an innocent woman in a commitment. She hadn't asked for a life she might not want, or refuse, and likely start a war. A bloody conflict that could destroy both of us and perhaps even her entire village. The weight of it pressed down on me, crushing. "There has to be another way," I said finally, my voice hoarse, a desperate plea. "Some test or trial I can undergo instead. Something to prove my worth, my intentions." Chief Gray Eagle's eyebrows raised slightly, the first crack in his stoic expression. He spoke to Kaylin, who looked genuinely surprised by his response, a flicker of hope in her eyes. "He says you speak like a warrior, not a coward. This is unexpected." She paused, her gaze still fixed on me. "He will consider your words. But first you must come to our village to understand what you are truly choosing. To see the life you would be entering." The young warrior Talon, who'd been fingering his weapon, spoke harshly, his voice laced with clear disagreement, with barely contained fury. Chief Gray Eagle silenced him with a sharp look and what sounded like a stern rebuke. "My cousin believes you should be forced to choose now," Kaylin explained, her voice low, almost apologetic. "He thinks you will try to escape if given time, that this is a trick." I met Talon's hostile glare, my own jaw tightening. I could see the barely contained violence there, the raw desire to solve this problem with blood instead of words. One wrong move, one sign of disrespect, and this canyon would become a battlefield, my grave. "I give you my word," I said, addressing Chief Gray Eagle directly, my gaze unwavering, trying to convey the sincerity I felt. "I won't run. I will come to your village. I will face your trials." As Kaylin translated, I realized I'd just committed myself to something far more dangerous than a simple marriage proposal. I'd agreed to enter an Apache village surrounded by people who had every reason to hate me, to face customs and trials I couldn't even imagine. But as they began to ride deeper into the mountains, one thought echoed in my mind, a new, unexpected resolve. I was no longer just trying to save my own life. Somehow, without meaning to, I'd become responsible for saving Kaylin's as well. The Apache village materialized from the rugged landscape like a mirage, becoming real. Hidden deep in a secluded valley between towering red cliffs, it was larger than I had expected. Dozens of traditional dwellings, wickiups and hogans, were scattered along a clear rushing stream. Smoke curled lazily from cooking fires, and the faint sound of children's laughter echoed off the canyon walls, a deceptively peaceful sound. But as our group approached, the laughter stopped. Faces appeared in doorways and from behind trees. Men, women, children, all watching the white man who rode among their warriors. Some expressions showed curiosity, a hesitant wonder. Others, like Talon's, barely concealed outright hostility, a simmering resentment. I felt like a wolf walking into a sheep pen, except I wasn't sure who was the predator here. The air grew heavy with their silent judgment. Chief Gray Eagle led us to the center of the village, where a large fire pit was surrounded by logs arranged in a perfect circle. An elderly woman emerged from the largest dwelling, her silver hair braided with turquoise beads, her face a roadmap of ancient wisdom and hard-won experience. Her eyes, sharp as obsidian, fixed on me with an intensity that made me want to look away, to shrink into myself. My grandmother Kaylin said quietly, a hint of apprehension in her voice, "Elder Willow. She is not pleased." Elder Willow spoke rapidly to Chief Gray Eagle, her voice rising with what was clearly anger, her words sharp, cutting through the air like knife blades. She gestured toward me several times, her disapproval palpable. Other villagers began to gather, forming a loose circle around the fire pit, their murmurs growing louder, their expressions mirroring Elder Willow's displeasure. "What's she saying?" I asked, my throat tight. Kalen's face flushed with embarrassment, her gaze dropping to the ground. "She says you smell like whiskey and violence. That bringing you here puts the whole village at risk. That you are a danger to our people." She paused, her voice barely a whisper. "She also says I have brought shame on our family by accepting gifts from a stranger, by allowing myself to be claimed by an outsider." The crowd grew larger and more agitated, their murmurs turning into a low hum of discontent. I could pick out individual voices now, some arguing, others demanding, their tones accusatory. A young man about my own age pushed forward, his face contorted with anger, speaking directly to Kalen with obvious passion. She shook her head repeatedly, her hands clasped tightly, but he persisted, his words a torrent. "Who's that?" I asked, though the raw jealousy blazing in the man's eyes made the answer painfully obvious. Talon. Kalen's voice was barely audible, laced with a mix of fear and resignation. "He has asked for my hand many times." Talon stepped closer to me, his hand resting menacingly on the knife at his belt, his eyes burning with hatred. He spoke in English, the words heavily accented, but clear enough, dripping with venom. "You take what is not yours, white man. You defile our customs. Leave now, or I will cut out your lying tongue and feed it to the coyotes." The threat sent a ripple of tension through the crowd. I felt the crushing weight of every eye upon me, every breath held. One wrong word, one aggressive move, and this would explode into violence. A bloodbath that would destroy any chance of peaceful resolution, of survival. "I didn't take anything," I said calmly, my voice steady despite the tremor in my hands. "I gave something. There's a difference. A big difference." Talon's face darkened, his jaw clenching. "You gave nothing. You trick sacred customs for your pleasure. Then run back to your people laughing at our traditions." Before I could respond, Elder Willow stepped between us, her small frame radiating an unexpected authority. She spoke sharply to Talon, her voice like cracking ice, and he reluctantly backed away, though his eyes never left my face, promising retribution. Then she turned her attention to her granddaughter, her voice heavy with disappointment, with a profound sadness. Kalen's shoulders sagged as she listened, her head bowed. When Elder Willow finished speaking, tears glistened in the young woman's eyes. "She says I must choose Kalen," whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "Either prove that your intentions are honorable by completing the marriage trials, or admit that I was foolish and accept Talon's proposal instead. To save my family from shame." The marriage trials, I felt my stomach drop, a cold dread spreading through me. "What kind of trials?" "3 tests, Kalen explained, her voice strengthening as she spoke, a flicker of defiance returning to her eyes. "Strength, wisdom, and sacrifice. If you fail any of them," she didn't need to finish. The alternative was written in the hostile faces surrounding us, in Talon's eager, predatory expression. Failure meant death, and success was looking more impossible by the minute. Chief Gray Eagle spoke again, and the crowd fell silent, his voice carrying the authority of law itself, of ancient tradition. "He says the trials begin at sunset." Kalen translated, her gaze meeting mine, a silent challenge. "And if you try to leave before they're completed, Talon has permission to hunt you down. He will not fail." I looked around the circle of faces, some hopeful, a few curious, but most eager for my failure, for the swift, bloody resolution they desired. But it was Kalen's expression that decided me. Behind the fear and uncertainty, I saw something that reminded me why I'd given her the blanket in the first place. She was worth protecting, worth fighting for, even if I didn't fully understand why. A primal instinct, a sense of rightness settled deep within me. "Then I guess we'd better get started," I said, my voice firm, a newfound resolve hardening my jaw. As the sun began to sink behind the towering canyon walls, painting the sky in fiery hues of orange and crimson, the entire village gathered around the central fire. The flames cast dancing shadows on the redstone cliffs, turning the peaceful valley into something primal and ancient, a stage for a drama centuries old. I stood at the edge of the circle, watching the Apache prepare for what felt more like a funeral than a wedding ceremony. The air was thick with anticipation, with the unspoken weight of my impending tests. Chief Gray Eagle approached, his movements slow and deliberate, carrying 3 objects: a thick braided rope, a piece of carved dark wood covered in intricate symbols that seemed to shift and dance in the firelight, and a small leather pouch that clinked softly when he moved. He set them down near the fire and began to speak, his voice carrying over the crackling flames, clear and resonant. "The first trial tests your strength," Kalen translated, standing beside me, her presence a silent comfort. "You must climb the sacred cliff face using only this rope, reach the eagle's nest, and bring back a feather. I looked up at the towering wall of stone that rose behind the village, a sheer, unforgiving monolith. Even in the fading light, I could see it was nearly vertical, with few visible handholds and loose rock that would crumble under weight. The eagle's nest was a dark smudge, a tiny, precarious tangle of sticks and bones perched about 60 feet up, impossibly high and dangerously exposed. Men have died attempting this, Talon added quietly, her voice laced with genuine concern. Even our own warriors sometimes fail. It is a test of true grit, not just muscle. Talon stepped forward, his eyes gleaming with malicious satisfaction, speaking loudly enough for everyone to hear his words, a sneering challenge. He gestured toward the cliff with obvious contempt, clearly suggesting that the white man would never succeed where Apache warriors had failed. He says you will fall like a stone, Talon, translated her voice flat, conveying the full weight of the insult. That your soft hands have never held anything harder than a whiskey bottle, that you are weak and unworthy. The insult stung because it wasn't entirely wrong. I was strong enough, years of ranch work had seen to that, but rope climbing wasn't exactly a common skill for cowboys. Still, I'd been in tighter spots. At least I hoped I had. I stripped off my coat and hat, feeling the evening chill bite at my skin, a sharp contrast to the heat radiating from the fire. The rope was rough hemp, thick and unyielding, worn smooth in places by the hands of previous climbers, some of whom had never returned. As I tested its strength, pulling against it, I could feel the weight of every eye in the village watching me, their hopes and doubts pressing down on me. The first 20 feet went easier than expected. My arms and shoulders burned a familiar ache, but years of hauling hay, breaking horses, and wrestling cattle had given me a raw, stubborn strength I didn't know I possessed. The rope bit into my palms, drawing blood, but I kept climbing, one hand over the other, my boots scrambling for purchase on the unforgiving cliff face, seeking out every tiny ledge, every minuscule crack. Halfway up, my luck ran out. A section of rock, seemingly solid, crumbled away beneath my left foot, sending a shower of pebbles cascading down into the firelight below. My foot slipped, leaving me swinging free on the rope, suspended precariously between the earth and the darkening sky. The crowd below gasped a collective intake of breath. I heard a sharp cry, someone, maybe Talon, calling out my name. My shoulders screamed in protest as they took my full weight, the muscles straining, threatening to tear. For a moment I hung there, spinning slowly, looking down at the upturned faces below, a dizzying array of expressions. Talon was smiling, a cruel, triumphant grin, already anticipating my failure, my inevitable plunge. But it was Talon's expression that drove me upward. Not fear, for me not pity, but fierce determination, a raw, unyielding will. It was as if she was climbing the cliff herself through sheer force of will, her spirit urging me on. Her eyes were locked on mine, a silent promise. A powerful surge of energy that flowed into my aching limbs. I found new footholds, digging my boots into tiny crevices, and continued my agonizing ascent. The eagle's nest loomed above me, a dark, tangled mass of sticks and bones built precariously on a narrow ledge. As I reached for it, a massive golden eagle burst from the shadows, talons extended, wings beating furiously around my head, a feathered whirlwind of fury. It screamed its outrage, a piercing cry that echoed through the canyon. I ducked narrowly, avoiding its strike, nearly losing my grip as the powerful bird circled, screeching. Its talons raked across my shoulder, tearing my shirt and drawing blood, a sharp, stinging pain. But there, caught in the thorny branches of the nest, was a single perfect feather, gleaming golden brown in the last rays of twilight. I lunged, grabbed it, and began my descent, muscles trembling with exhaustion, every fiber of my being screaming in protest. Every foot downward was agony, but I refused to let go. I would not fail. When my boots finally touched the ground, my legs buckled and I collapsed to my knees, gasping for breath, my body shaking uncontrollably. The village erupted in surprised murmurs, a wave of hushed astonishment. Even Talon looked stunned, his smug expression replaced by grudging disbelief that the white man had succeeded. I held up the eagle feather, its golden brown surface gleaming triumphantly in the firelight. Chief Gray Eagle took the feather and examined it carefully, his fingers tracing its delicate barbs before nodding his approval. He spoke briefly, his voice still solemn but with a hint of something new. Talon translated with obvious relief, a tremor of emotion in her voice. He says the eagle fought you, but you persevered. You showed courage. The first trial is complete. But before I could even catch my breath, before the adrenaline had fully receded, Chief Gray Eagle picked up the carved wooden piece. It was covered in intricate symbols that seemed to shift and dance in the firelight, an ancient, enigmatic puzzle. The second trial, test your wisdom, Talon said, her voice growing tense again, the relief from the first trial already fading. You must solve the riddle of the ancestor stone before the fire burns down to embers. You must understand its meaning, its lesson. I looked at the symbols, then at the fire. It was large now, a roaring blaze, but wood burned fast in the dry mountain air. I had maybe an hour, probably less. My mind raced, trying to grasp the enormity of the task. What happens if I can't solve it? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Kaylin hesitated, her eyes filled with a fresh wave of apprehension. Then you have failed 2 trials, and failure means… She didn't finish. But the answer was written in Talon's eager, hungry expression. Failure meant death, and success was looking more impossible by the minute. As I stared at the ancestor stone, trying desperately to make sense of symbols that might as well have been written by aliens, one thought echoed in my mind, a chilling whisper. How do you solve a riddle when you don't even understand language it's written in? I turned the carved stone over in my bleeding hands, the rough wood, a stark contrast to my raw, abraded skin. The symbols seemed to mock me with their ancient mystery, their impenetrable meaning. The fire crackled lower, each spark that died taking me closer to failure, closer to my inevitable end. Around the circle, villagers whispered among themselves, some shaking their heads, their faces etched with pity or disdain, as if my defeat was already certain. The symbols were unlike anything I'd seen before. Some looked like animals, a bear, an eagle, what might have been a snake. Others resembled natural features, mountains, rivers, the sun and moon. But how they connected, what story they told, remained as impenetrable as the cliff I'd just climbed. My mind raced, trying to find a pattern, a logic, anything to grasp onto. Can you give me a hint? I asked Kaylin desperately, my voice strained, my eyes pleading. She shook her head, genuine sadness in her eyes, a silent apology. The wisdom trial must be completed alone. To help you would dishonor both of us. It must come from within you. Talon spoke up from across the fire, his voice dripping with satisfaction, his words sharp and mocking. Even without translation, I could tell he was declaring victory, prematurely reveling in my perceived failure. Several villagers nodded in agreement, their faces grim. The fire burned lower, its flames shrinking, casting longer, more distorted shadows. Time was running out. I forced myself to think differently. Maybe the solution wasn't in understanding Apache symbols, but in understanding universal truths. Every culture had stories, patterns that repeated across time and place. Cycles, life-death seasons. I studied the stone again, looking for familiar elements, for a glimmer of recognition. There in the center, a spiral. It could represent the cycle of seasons, the endless turning of time. Around it, the animals I'd identified earlier, but now I noticed they were arranged in a specific order. The bear in the position where the sun would be in summer, powerful and dominant. The eagle where it would be in spring, soaring, reborn. The snake where autumn would fall, shedding old skin, preparing for change. Seasons, I murmured aloud, a spark of an idea igniting in my mind. It's about the seasons. But that couldn't be the whole answer. There were other symbols, other elements that didn't fit the purely seasonal pattern. A figure that looked like a person standing at the very center of the spiral lines, radiating outward from the human figure to each animal. Then it hit me, a sudden blinding flash of insight. Not just seasons, but the relationship between humans and nature through the seasons. The choices humans make in response to the world around them. The bear for summer, when they hunted for food to store, taking what they needed, sometimes by force. The eagle for spring, when they needed its strength to build and grow to reach for new heights. The snake for autumn, when they prepared for the coming winter, shedding old ways like a snake shed its skin, adapting to survive. And winter, there in the fourth position, was a symbol I'd missed before. Not an animal, but what looked like a blanket or maybe a shelter. Something that provided protection and warmth when the world turned cold, when life became harsh. My heart began to race, a frantic drumbeat in my chest. This wasn't just a riddle about seasons. It was about my story, my journey to this place. The choices I had made. The riddle isn't asking what the symbols mean, I said aloud, my voice carrying across the suddenly quiet circle, ringing with conviction. It's asking why I'm here. I stood up, holding the stone toward Chief Gray Eagle, my gaze fixed on his ancient, unreadable face. Each symbol represents a choice. The bear, the choice to take what you need by force to conquer. The eagle, the choice to soar above others' suffering, to remain detached. The snake, the choice to shed your responsibilities when times get hard, to abandon. And the blanket? I paused, looking directly at Kaylin, her eyes wide with understanding, the choice to give warmth even when it costs you. To offer protection, to sacrifice for another. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, a faint red pulse in the darkness. But Chief Gray Eagle held up his hand to stop the trial, his eyes gleaming with a new light. He spoke quickly to Kaylin, who looked stunned by my answer, tears welling in her eyes. He says, "You understand that wisdom isn't about knowing our symbols, but about knowing yourself." She translated, her voice choked with emotion. The ancestor stone shows the 4 paths a man can take when faced with another's suffering. You chose the path of the blanket, the path of compassion and responsibility. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, a wave of genuine surprise. Even Talon looked stunned, his jaw slack. But Chief Gray Eagle wasn't finished speaking. The second trial is complete. Kaylin continued, her voice gaining strength, a new hope blossoming within it. But Grandfather says, the third trial is the most dangerous. It tests not your body or mind, but your heart. It will ask you to give up what you hold dearest. Chief Gray Eagle picked up the leather pouch, and the clinking sound of its contents seemed ominous in the near darkness, a chilling prelude to what was to come. When he opened it, I saw it contained small bones, finger bones carved with more symbols ancient and unsettling. The trial of sacrifice, Talon whispered, her voice barely audible. You must choose what you're willing to lose to gain what you claim to want, to truly become one of us. As the bones scattered on the ground in patterns only Chief Gray Eagle could read, I realized that surviving the first 2 trials might have been the easy part, because what was coming next would ask me to examine the one thing I'd been avoiding since this all began, what I truly wanted, and what I was willing to pay to get it. The bone casting seemed to take forever, each moment stretching into an eternity. Chief Gray Eagle studied the pattern with the intensity of a man reading life and death in scattered fragments, his eyes piercing the veil of the unknown. The village held its collective breath, a tangible tension in the air as he finally spoke, his words heavy with the weight of ancient law, of irreversible fate. The bones have chosen the sacrifice, Talon translated, her voice barely audible, trembling with apprehension. You must give up the thing you value most in this world. Only then can you claim what you seek. Only then can you truly belong. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. What if I don't know what I value most? I asked, my voice a desperate plea. Chief Gray Eagle smiled grimly, a knowing, almost pitying expression on his face. He gestured toward my horse, Thunder, still saddled and waiting patiently at the edge of the village, a symbol of my freedom, my escape. Then he pointed to the gun belt around my waist, my pistol gleaming dully in the firelight, my protection, my power. Finally, his finger settled on the faded photograph tucked into my shirt pocket, a picture of my parents, the only thing I had left of my family, my past. He says a man always knows. Talon whispered, her eyes filled with a profound sadness, as if she understood the pain of the choice before me. The bones will reveal what you try to hide from yourself, what your heart truly clings to. Talon stepped forward, speaking rapidly and gesturing toward the scattered bones, his tone challenging, almost mocking. Several other villagers nodded in agreement with whatever he was saying, their faces reflecting his skepticism. My cousin says this is foolishness, Talon explained, her voice low, that no white man would sacrifice anything real for an Apache woman. He believes you will choose to leave rather than give up what matters to you, that you are a coward. I looked at each item Chief Gray Eagle had indicated. My horse represented freedom, the ability to go anywhere, be anyone, to escape this impossible situation. My gun meant protection, the power to defend myself in a hostile world, to fight for my life. And the photograph, that was my past, my identity, the last tangible connection to who I'd been before this moment, before Talon, before this village. It was my anchor to a life that no longer existed. But as I stood there, surrounded by faces lit by dying embers, by the weight of their expectations and my own desperate need for understanding, I realized something that surprised me, something that shifted the very ground beneath my feet. None of those things felt as important as they had yesterday. The horse was just an animal, a means to an end. The gun was just a tool, a way to inflict violence. Even the photograph, precious as it was, represented people who were already gone, a past that could never be reclaimed. What mattered was the living. What mattered was the woman standing beside me, her eyes fixed on mine, her fate intertwined with mine. Caught between worlds because of my actions, because of a simple act of kindness. I know what I have to sacrifice, I said quietly, my voice steady, imbued with a newfound clarity. I reached into my shirt and pulled out the photograph. My parents stared back at me from the faded paper, their smiles frozen in time. My father stern and proud. My mother gentle and kind. For years this image had been my anchor, the reminder of where I came from and who I was supposed to be. But holding on to the past meant I couldn't embrace the future. It meant I couldn't truly be here now with Talon. I walked to the fire pit and knelt beside the glowing embers, the heat, a welcome warmth against my cold hands. I sacrifice my old life, I said, my voice carrying to every corner of the village, clear and resolute. The man I was, the plans I had, the world I knew. I give it all up to become the man Talon deserves, to become the man your people can trust. I placed the photograph on the coals. The paper caught fire, immediately curling and blackening, the images of my parents disappearing into smoke, dissolving into ash. The loss hit me like a physical blow, a sharp, profound ache in my chest, a tearing away of a part of myself. But I didn't flinch or look away. I watched it burn, accepting the sacrifice, embracing the change. The village erupted in surprised murmurs, a wave of stunned disbelief. Even Talon seemed genuinely stunned by the gesture, his face a mask of unexpected awe. But it was Talon's expression that mattered most, wonder, and something deeper, something that looked like the beginning of love shining in her dark eyes. Chief Gray Eagle spoke again, his voice filled with a profound respect that hadn't been there before, a new warmth. He says, you have proven yourself worthy. Ayana translated, tears streaming down her face, her voice choked with emotion. Not because you completed the trials, but because you understood what they truly meant. Strength without wisdom is useless. Wisdom without sacrifice is meaningless. You have shown us your true heart. Elder Willow, the grandmother who had been so hostile earlier, approached me with something in her hands. It was a new shirt, made of soft deer hide, decorated with intricate beadwork in vibrant colors. She spoke softly as she offered it to me, her sharp eyes now holding a hint of approval, even affection. She says, "Welcome to the family, son. You are one of us now." Kaylin whispered, her voice thick with tears of joy. As I put on the shirt, feeling the soft leather against my skin, I felt something shift inside me. The cowboy who had ridden into this valley no longer existed. In his place stood a man who had chosen love over freedom, connection over independence, future over past. A man reborn in the heart of the Apache. Talon approached, his earlier hostility replaced by a grudging respect, a reluctant acknowledgement of my worth. He spoke briefly to me in English, his voice rough but sincere. "You fight like Apache," he said simply, his gaze steady. "She chose well. You are worthy." As the village began to celebrate around us, a joyous cacophony of drums, singing, and laughter, I took Kaylin's hand. The blanket, my grandmother's blanket, was still draped over her shoulders, a constant reminder of how this all began. But now it meant something different than it had that snowy morning. Now it was exactly what the Apache had always seen it, as a promise, a commitment, a choice to put someone else's warmth before your own. A bond forged in hardship, sealed by sacrifice. "Do you regret it?" Kaylin asked quietly, her voice soft, her eyes searching mine. "Giving up your old life? All that you knew?" I looked into her dark eyes, seeing my future reflected there. A future I could never have imagined, yet now embraced with all my heart. It wasn't the life I'd planned, but it was the life I'd chosen. And sometimes I realized the best decisions were the ones you made with your heart instead of your head. "The only thing I regret," I said, pulling her closer, feeling the warmth of her hand in mine, "is that it took me so long to understand what that blanket really meant. That it meant you. That it meant home." As the celebration continued around us, the drums beating a joyous rhythm, I knew that tomorrow would bring new challenges. Learning Apache customs, finding my place in this tight-knit community, building a marriage based on respect and love rather than just circumstance. But tonight, with Kaylin's hand in mine and my grandmother's blanket wrapped around both our shoulders, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. I felt like I was home. Sometimes it's the smallest acts of kindness that end up changing everything. The story of Jedediah Stone and his grandmother's old blanket reminds us that compassion, whether born out of instinct or quiet guilt, can leave a mark far deeper than we realize. In the later years of life, after walking through storms and carrying the weight of loss, it's easy to grow cautious, to close ourselves off, or to feel like we have nothing left to give. But often it's in those rare moments when we dare to open our hearts and give, when we let go of the past, that we discover true healing. Jedediah's simple act didn't just save a life in the snow, it saved his own weary soul. For those who carry regret or sorrow deep within, this truth resonates. It's never too late to reach out, to make amends, and to begin again. Sometimes helping someone else isn't just about them, it's the very thing that allows us to find our way home.